Hello, this is Dr. James Camp at Lee College in Baytown, Texas. Welcome to my lecture on body fluid balancing acts for anatomy and physiology semester. Today we're going to describe four main points. We're going to describe the major body fluid compartments. We're going to explain water balancing, how water is gained and lost by the body and how that process is regulated. We're going to describe pH buffering and acid-base balance in the body, and we're going to introduce the balancing and regulation of body fluid electrolyte levels. Okay, so when we're talking about body fluid balances, what exactly do we mean by body fluids? When you first hear the word body fluids, you probably think of fluids like urine or saliva that come out of a person's body. That's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is the kinds of fluids that stay inside a person's body and keep that person's body well hydrated and working properly. Now, you may have heard that our bodies are about 65% water. So the question becomes, where is all that water? That 65%, by the way, is sort of a population average. The older you get, the less water there is in your body. When babies are born, they're about 3/4 water, 75%. By the time you get to extreme old age, you may be as low as 45%. But for the average adult, if you're well hydrated, your body has about two-thirds of your body mass is water. Now, you may have noticed that you're not just sloshing around as you walk across the room or sit there in your chair. So clearly that 65% water has to be packaged in some way. It has to be kept in specific places so that our bodies don't just become pools of liquid. So where is all that water? The most obvious answer would be in your blood. But blood makes up only about 5 out of that 65%, even though it seems to be the most liquid part of our bodies. So where is the rest of the water? The answer is that 2/3 of our water is actually inside our cells. Not only not sloshing around, but actually hard at work keeping our cellular machinery in motion. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that water today because your cells do a very good job of maintaining their internal environment by themselves. The rest of the water is in our tissues, something we call interstitial fluid. Fluid between things is what that means. It provides a space around our cells for them to move and do their work. It provides a cushion against too much trauma. And of course, in certain very fluid compartments like your joint cavities or your serous membranes around the heart, for example, that fluid can work as a true liquid, can lubricate all sorts of body movements. Okay, so all that talk about body fluids is a little abstract. So let's take a concrete example here. We're going to look at one skeletal muscle in our body. So as you remember, a skeletal muscle is made of very long, thin cells called skeletal muscle fibers. So this long stripy thing here represents one skeletal muscle cell. Inside that is intracellular fluid. Okay, so that intracellular fluid is in the red boxes here, or in the red column at the top of the screen here. It's going to be found inside the cells. It's going to have high potassium, because remember that's necessary for maintaining the membrane potential. And it's going to have a lot of magnesium because that's important for a lot of intracellular functions. At the same time, it's going to have low sodium and low chloride because that's also necessary for maintaining that membrane potential that lets us trigger a skeletal muscle contraction. It's got low calcium intracellularly, except during a muscle contraction. It's got high phosphate because that's needed to make ATP. And muscle cells, like most cells, are very high in protein because proteins do most of the work of a cell. It's not too much of an exaggeration to say that everything a cell does is done by a protein. Okay, but that's not the only fluid in the muscle. In between all of the cells, there's a lot of space. Maybe not an awful lot of space, but there is space. And that space is full of a fluid known as interstitial fluid. Sometimes this is referred to as tissue fluid. Sometimes it's referred to as extracellular fluid by, mostly by cell biologists. But today we're going to refer to it as interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is found in the green column in the middle of the table here. It's inside the tissue, but not inside the cells. It's going to have a low potassium and magnesium and a high sodium and chloride. Again, that's to maintain that cell membrane potential that allows us to trigger skeletal muscle cells in the first place. It's going to have a low calcium and a low phosphate because if it had a high calcium, you'd start crystallizing calcium in your tissue and it would become hard like a bone. That does happen sometimes with people who have too much calcium in their body. And finally, the interstitial fluid is going to have low dissolved protein. That doesn't mean there's no protein there. Collagen fibers, for example, are proteins, but the amount of protein that's dissolved in the fluid is very low. Finally, we have the interstitial fluid, or the intravascular, I'm sorry. Finally, we have the intravascular fluid. So this is the fluid that flows into the tissue through all of its blood vessels. And so in all of this blood vessel area here, those blood vessels are going to be filled with intravascular fluid. Now, what's the fluid inside blood vessels? Obviously, it's blood plasma. But when we talk about the compartments of the body, instead of calling it blood plasma, we call it intravascular fluid. So where is it? It's inside the blood vessels. What is it? It's almost identical to the interstitial tissue fluid, except in one respect. It's high in protein. That's because when with the Starling flow and diffusion processes and such that allow fluid to cross between the intravascular and interstitial fluids, small things like potassium and magnesium cross back and forth. Small things like sodium and chloride pass back and forth. Small things like calcium and phosphate pass back and forth. But protein does not pass back and forth. It's kept inside the intravascular compartment, inside the blood plasma. Okay. How does fluid get into and out of a particular compartment? Well, solutes, the salts and electrolytes and pH acid-base components and things that we'll talk about later, those travel by diffusion from a blood capillary to a tissue. They travel in a much more complicated way between the tissue and the cells. The cells can choose what moves in and what moves out, as we talked about some in A&P1. But what about the movement of water? Water moves by a process we call osmosis. You've seen this before in A&P1, but it's worth mentioning again. If you have a compartment of fluid that has lots of water and very little solute, and you put that right next to a compartment of fluid that has, more or less the same amount of water, but much more solute. It's as if the compartment on the right has less available water, less water that's not busy taking care of solutes, and the compartment on the left has very little solute, so it has lots of available water. What's going to happen then is that the place where there's more available water is going to send water into the compartment that has less available water, that has more solutes. So basically, water goes from a place with more water to a place with less water. Or another way of thinking of it, it goes from a place where the water is more dilute to a place where the solute is more concentrated. So how does that work in practical life? When you've taken in some fluid, let's say you're drinking some water just before you exercise, as is the case over here in the picture to the left, that fluid that you drink gets absorbed by your digestive tract into your blood. As it circulates, that makes the blood more like this compartment over here that has more water and less solute. So as that water flows through your tissues, which still have a normal amount of solute and a normal amount of water, the blood, which now has more water and less solute, sends its water into the tissue. And from there, the water can even osmose into the cells, which makes the cells swell up a little bit. This is the process by which your whole body gets hydrated. But what about the opposite? What about when you have been working out for a little bit, for example, or just walking across campus in July heat? You start sweating, you start losing water through your skin and even through your breathing. And in this case, water is being pulled out of your blood to fuel that sweat. Okay? If the water leaves your blood to fuel sweat, then your blood becomes more like the second compartment we talked about over here. It suddenly has less water and more solute. So what's it going to do? It's going to pull water out of the other tissues that it's going through in order to fuel that movement of water into your sweat. Pulling water out of your tissues means those tissues also become slightly dehydrated, and they're going to pull water out of your cells. And so the cells, instead of swelling up, they shrink down a little bit. And that's the process by which your body becomes dehydrated. Okay. So we've talked about body fluids in general and how things move between the compartments. Now we're going to talk for the rest of this presentation about how those compartments get regulated. Intracellular fluid, also known to cell biologists as cytosol, is for the most part managed by the cell. So that becomes a cell biology problem, and this isn't a cell biology class. It's a whole body human anatomy and physiology class. So rather than spending much time on that, we're going to pretty much ignore this unless you want to go take a cell biology class somewhere. Interstitial fluid and intravascular fluid, also known as, say, tissue fluid and blood plasma, tend to exist in equilibrium with each other. That is, if I add a little more salt to my blood plasma, it's going to diffuse into my intravascular fluid. If I take a little bit of glucose out of my interstitial fluid, it's going to pull glucose out of my blood to refill. They're going to equilibrate with each other. Therefore, when the body regulates the fluid circulating in the blood, the intravascular fluid, it is effectively regulating the fluid in all of your body tissues at the same time. So, we're going to focus on balancing the fluid in the blood, knowing that through the equilibrium blood maintains with tissue fluid, we're effectively managing all of our tissues at the same time. What's the upshot there? Basically, for the rest of this presentation, we're going to be talking about regulating what's in your blood with the assumption that your blood will in turn regulate what's in all of your other tissues. Okay, what are those balancing acts or regulatory processes we're going to be talking about? Total fluid balance is basically the balancing of water gain and water loss to keep your body from getting dehydrated. And we're going to talk about two kinds of regulation there. One is how we stimulate water intake, and the other is how we reduce water loss. The second balancing act is your acid-base balance. For a number of reasons, it's very important that your body have just the right pH. And when we say just the right pH, we're talking about 7.4 plus or minus 0.05. So that's a range of 7.35 pH units to 7.45 pH units. That is a tremendously narrow range. And so your body has to constantly work at keeping your tissues in that range. And it does so by employing three different buffer systems that we're going to talk about in the acid-base balance section. And finally, we're going to talk briefly about electrolyte balances. More on the principal electrolyte balances will come up in the endocrine system chapter, but we're going to talk a little bit about particularly how sodium, potassium, and calcium are kept in their, they also have very narrow ranges. Okay, so let's start with the overall fluid balance, which basically means balancing water input and when we get to this chapter, we often get asked the question, how much water should you really drink? Is it true that there's a certain amount of water everyone should drink every day? First off, that begs the question, does everyone need the same amount of water? And the answer there is not necessarily. In colder climates, less water is needed because you don't perspire as much. In hot climates, more water is needed because your body puts more water out through perspiration. I could add to that in drier climates, your body loses more water through processes called transpiration, that is water coming out of your lungs and out of your skin passively. So you could live in equally hot climates, but if one person lived in the desert and the other person lived in humid Houston, the person in the desert would need more water per day than the Houstonian. The second point is that the amount of sweat loss can actually vary tremendously depending not just on the external conditions, whether it's cold, whether it's hot, whether it's dry or wet, but also on your exercise level. A passive person might lose, a passive person in a cold, wet climate might lose only 100 milliliters per day of sweat. A very active person can lose 2 liters per hour of sweat, depending on their exercise level and the external conditions. And finally, the amount of urine loss can vary tremendously, from half a liter to several liters per day. If you don't drink enough water, your urine, of course, will be more concentrated and you won't put out as much urine. but other factors can control your urine output as well. For example, if you drink lots of caffeine, that's a natural diuretic, and that's going to cause you to put out more urine fluid, which will actually dehydrate your body some. So, in other words, don't use a caffeinated soda as a hydration beverage. It's just not going to help you. Instead of following, a one-size-fits-all guideline, the better guideline would be that you should drink enough water that, on the one hand, you urinate several times a day, which indicates that your body is not trying desperately to conserve water, that it's well hydrated enough to produce urine. And second, that your urine is typically a pale yellow color. Urine that is dark yellow usually indicates dehydration, and you need to be drinking more water. But what about that 8 ounce glass of water per day rule that we keep hearing about? That would be 64 ounces of water a day, which is 1.9 liters. Is that a good guideline? Well, the U.S. recommended daily intake for minimum water intake is actually 2.7 liters per day for adult females and 3.7 liters per day for adult males. That translates to 11 and a half glasses of water for females and 15 and a half glasses of water for males. You may ask yourself then, seriously, am I really supposed to drink 16 glasses of water a day if I'm a male or 12 if I'm female? That's a lot of water. Well, the answer is that not all of that water has to come from drinking. In fact, we generally would expect that it would. Okay. Whenever we talk about balancing inputs and outputs, we want to list what we call sources and sinks. Sources are things that provide or add fluid to the system. Sinks are things that drain away fluid from the system. So let's look at the sources first. We're going to look at one woman's 2,700 milliliters per day of water. She seems to be, from this picture, a tennis player who likes to keep herself well hydrated. She can get water from two kinds of ways. One is called preformed water, that is, it comes into your body as water. The other is called metabolic water. If you remember, we had that equation that glucose plus 6 oxygen gives you 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus a large amount of ATP. We've talked before about where the O2 comes from. It comes in through your lungs, rides around your body on hemoglobin. And we've talked about what happens to the CO2. It gets converted to carbonic acid, rides around your blood, and then exits in the lungs. But we didn't talk about what happens to that 6 molecules of H2O. Well, your body keeps it, and that becomes what we call metabolic water. So it turns out that the average person with an average metabolism produces about 300 milliliters of metabolic water per day. That's not anywhere close to that 2,700 milliliters that we need. So obviously, we're going to have to get some preformed water to add to that. The woman pictured here gets about 900 milliliters of water from the food she eats. No matter how dry a food may seem, it's always got some amount of water in it. And particularly, if you eat fruits or particularly flexible vegetables or even most meats that aren't overcooked still have a good amount of water in them. So you can get almost a liter of water a day just from eating food. But if you do your math, that leaves us with that's 1,200 milliliters. That leaves us with our person needing to drink 1,500 milliliters a day to get that 2,700 recommended daily intake. And that 1,500 milliliters, 1.5 liters, that looks a lot closer to that 8-ounce glasses that they tell us we're supposed to drink. So maybe that's where that comes from. So if we take in almost 3 liters of water per day, where does all of that water go? The water sinks come in 2 flavors. One is what we call insensible water loss. That's water that you don't notice going out of your body, or if you do, it's not really measurable. So all of the numbers that we include in this category will be basically estimates. The other category is sensible water loss. That's water that you can definitely notice coming out of your body and can in fact trap and measure very easily. So we know with some certainty how much water comes out in those routes. So if we look first at the insensible water losses, we can estimate at least how much water is coming out of the body in each of these routes. Unless you live in a place where the air has 100% humidity, the air you take into your body is always going to be drier than the air you breathe out, because as that air travels through your airways, it gets humidified by all that mucus and water in your airways. So over a day's worth of breathing, the average person in the average climate loses about 300 milliliters of water just by breathing. We also eject water that passively evaporates from our skin. This is a process called transpiration. And that's also estimated at about 300 milliliters over the course of a day. Again, that depends on how warm it is outside and or how warm it is around you, and also how humid it is around you. Living in a more humid place will reduce your transpiration losses. That brings us to the question of sweat. You can lose, as I said, as little as 100 milliliters a day in sweat, or you can lose a lot more. Let's say that this person, it looks like she just played a game of tennis, so perhaps she worked out for a good half hour at kind of a mild pace. So we'll say that she lost about half a liter, 500 milliliters of water in sweat today. So that adds up to 1,100 milliliters of water. Still doesn't account for that 2,700 milliliters that we took in on the previous page. Well, now we can get to the sensible water loss. As dry as feces is, and as good as our colon is at absorbing every last bit of water from it, still about 100 milliliters a day of water come out of your body in your feces. Not a lot, but a small contribution. By far, the biggest removal of water from your body, unless you are an athlete who sweats an awful lot, the biggest water output from your body is in the urine. Now, for a typical person, 500 milliliters per day of urine is obligatory. That is, you're obliged to produce that much urine. You don't have a choice. For most of us, though, we're able to produce more urine than that. Now, if you're extremely dehydrated, you're still going to produce your 500 milliliters of obligatory urine every day. That's how much your body needs to make to get rid of all those waste products and toxins that build up in our body. But depending on how much water you take in and how much you perspire and how much all of these other factors add up to, you might have between 500 and a couple of thousand milliliters of water a day. If we take 2,700 milliliters and subtract all of the other numbers on this page, we end up with this woman probably producing about 1,000 milliliters of adjustable or facultative urine. So That's the amount that she adds to her urine to get rid of excess water. And that would probably give her that pale yellow urine that we've talked about that's a good thing. All right, so I'm going to encourage you to pause your recording here for a moment and see if you can fill in these blanks from your memory from what we just discussed on the previous couple of pages. All right, on the fluid intake side, a small amount, about 300 milliliters of metabolic water is produced inside our body every day from chemical reactions. The rest, at least 2.4 liters in females or 3.4 liters in males, has to come from ingested food and drink. Almost a liter of that can come from your ingested food, possibly more if you eat a lot. But still, that leaves the average female needing about 1.5 liters of water to drink every day, and the average male needing about 2.5 liters per day. On the fluid output side, most of the water, at least 500 milliliters, but often as much as a couple of liters, is lost in the urine. Another 400 or so milliliters is lost through the skin by a combination of transpiration and perspiration. Another 300 milliliters is exhaled by the lungs in the form of water vapor. And finally, about 100 milliliters is lost in the feces. Ooh, yuck, gross. Finally, we want to talk about the regulation of fluid balance. We can regulate fluid in two ways. We can regulate how much water comes into your body, and we can regulate how much water goes out. The main regulator of fluid intake is a part of your brain known as the thirst center, which is found in our favorite regulatory part of the brain, the hypothalamus. The thirst center of the hypothalamus regulates water intake when it is stimulated, or it stimulates water intake when it is stimulated by a couple of things. Dry mouth is actually one of the main stimulants of the hypothalamus. There are hydration sensors in the mucous membranes of your oral cavity, and when your saliva becomes dehydrated, your entire mouth becomes dehydrated, and that stimulates your hypothalamus to feel thirsty. There are also osmoreceptors. Remember, it's osmotic pressure on the hypothalamus that is its main signal of dehydration in the body. When there's not enough water in the blood, the water can't osmose out of the blood, and so it puts less pressure on those sensors in the hypothalamus. And finally, the hormone angiotensin is released in cases of low blood pressure, and that causes the hypothalamus to feel thirsty as well. And what the hypothalamus does in response is it signals to your conscious brain that you should feel thirsty right now. And hopefully that will lead the person to drink more water, and you will have some fluid intake. But what if we can't increase our fluid intake right now? In that case, we would need to decrease our fluid output. The kidneys, of course, are the main regulators of fluid output. As you may recall from our kidney talk, water loss is directly opposed by the hormone ADH, that's antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. The hormones aldosterone and angiotensin also act to retain more water in the body by retaining sodium. And as we've talked about, water tends to follow sodium. So if you retain more sodium in the body, you'll retain more water. And finally, the hormone ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, increases the amount of sodium leaving in the urine, so it increases the amount of water leaving in the urine. So if for some reason you're taking in too much water in a day, you can excrete more of it in your urine.